This is module 1A of our course, HIS 218, that's Terrorism and International Relations. We are going to be focusing, first of all, on definitions, trying to understand what terrorism is. So, the question, what is terrorism, is very critical at the beginning of the course to try to find out what are the different conceptualizations of terrorism. How do people conceptualize terrorism? What do they explain terrorism? How do they explain terrorism? Now, this is very important in the sense that there are various positions on what terrorism is. Uh, Definitions of terrorism are vast, and from different groups, they see terrorism differently, and they create different conceptual, approach towards understanding terrorism. Consequently, we will attempt to define terrorism with a very broad definition that will incorporate so many other views of how terrorism should be conceptualized. So our working definition will be this particular one. It says terrorism is the calculated use of unlawful violence or threat of unlawful violence to create fear intended to force or to intimidate governments or societies into accepting goals, or agendas that are generally political, religious, or ideological. Now, this definition may not be all encompassing. We've tried as much as possible to make it all encompassing, but it may not, cover all the other angles or conceptualizations of terrorism, because the judicial see terrorism differently. They conceptualize terrorism differently. Governments conceptualize terrorism differently. Non-governmental organizations, non-state actors, they conceptualize terrorism differently. Even individuals, academics in different fields, from political science to history, they conceptualize terrorism differently. But for the purpose of this lecture, we will try to make use of this definition and have at the back of our mind that this definition is anchored to acts committed by persons or organizations or governments. So we're looking at terrorism, we're trying to conceptualize terrorism from the viewpoint of the above acts that have been outlined as, having been perpetrated by persons or organizations or governments. Now, it is important for us to observe certain key things in our definition, or any other conceptualization of terrorism at all must be able to contain these issues, these key issues. Number one, violence. The use of violence is critical in attempting to define terrorism. Any form of definition of or conceptualization of terrorism must be able to encapsulate, the various forms of violence that are, found within the confines of terrorism. And also, the concept of fear is integral in defining terrorism, from any viewpoint at all. Also, intimidation, which is very critical to trying to understand, what terrorism is and how terrorism is effected. Now, the forcing of governments or societies or groups is also critical in trying to understand or conceptualize terrorism. And last but not the least is the agendas that are involved in terrorist acts. Any form of terrorism at all, as defined or conceptualized, must always have, must always take into cognizance the agenda of the terrorist group. That means in defining terrorism, we must also bear in mind, we must always, bear in mind that there has to be an agenda in any form of terrorist activity, any form of terrorist, attack, or whatever the case may be. Secondly, and most importantly, in attempting to conceptualize terrorism and understand the broad views and various definitions and viewpoints on terrorism, it is important for us to be able to understand the various relationships that connect terrorism with other forms of violence or other forms, of conflicts. Now, uh, these are the areas that make or create a difficult terrain in trying to, maneuver through the issues of terrorism. How terrorism relates, if we look at this diagram, we'll see how terrorism relates with other forms of violence. And there is a thin line, you can see there's a thin line between guerrilla warfare here and terrorism. But in between these two forms of conflicts, we have revolutionaries. Those are things like revolutionary wars and revolutions, and we have anarchist activities, and also we have the activities of freedom fighters. So we can see that it is very difficult to straight jacket the definition of terrorism because it borders on relationship with other forms of conflict that makes it quite difficult to separate what terrorism is, or what guerrilla warfare is, or what anarchist activities or revolutionary activities are, or what are the activities of freedom fighters. Now, to this end, it is very important, for students of international relations to observe that it is in the application of the characteristics of terrorism, it is in the application of those characteristics that defines what a terrorist group is or who a terrorist is. Because every form of violent conflict which we see here in this diagram has, one way or the other, some forms of terrorist, activities. The killing of people, the using of violence, the using of, intimidation, the using of coercion, so on and so forth. However, it is the application that will eventually determine for us which do we refer, or which group do we classify as, or which persons do we classify as terrorists. Now, later on, we're going to see that it is difficult, very, very difficult to classify certain people or certain groups or certain, organizations as terrorist groups or individuals because of the application of these various terrorist factors which we have, characteristics which we have mentioned. So it is in the application, and we're also going to see how ideology, affects the application. Some people have different ideology, so they apply these characteristics differently, and by so doing, label people differently. So because we hold onto a different ideology, you apply the label of terrorists on certain people differently. You say these people are terrorists because of the ideology that you hold, while some other people can also apply, the label of terrorists on some other sets of people or organizations because of their own personal ideology. Now, this brings us to the end of the first module. We're going to continue this class in the next module. Thank you.